first big policy announcement that came up recently was National's policy around breaks, those being gone by lunchtime. And Richard, what is it with National and getting rid of workers' breaks?
Yeah, look, it's disappointing, but I don't think it's really surprising. National really has a long track record when it comes to employment relations, and they seem to lean against workers and workers' representatives, their unions, and we're seeing that again. I guess a leopard doesn't change its spots, and that's what we're seeing here. It's what we can be certain of, I think, is if National were to be in government, that we would definitely be in for a hard time working people.
Yeah, you can see that, for example, with their extension of the 90-day trial period. They continue to go on about and they continually rehash this policy. I struggle a little bit with it because is there actually any evidence that this sort of policy actually promotes more job creation?
No, there isn't. And in fact, there's evidence to show quite the opposite because Motto did a study for Treasury in the last period of government and found that it didn't create any jobs or provide any advantage to the disadvantaged, which was meant to be the idea behind it. So it had no beneficial impact on employment. But what we do know is that tens of thousands of people were put on trials and tens of thousands of them were dismissed either during or after their trial. I think in the last period, I had the figure here, I think 2017, 2018 period, something like 80,000 people were taken on a 90-day trial and over 20,000 of them were laid off during or at the conclusion of the trial. And I think that's really one of the big stories about the 90-day trials, that not only did they not do any good, they arguably did a lot of damage because I think it's a very responsible thing to employ people. You don't just pick people up and drop them like it doesn't matter. For many people, it's their first time in employment. They're vulnerable. This is a way to knock people's confidence, not to build it. So once again,
make their work more precarious as well.
Make them vulnerable to all kinds of things, and also set them up for a bad start in life. Because we know work can be very, very good for people, but actually we know bad work is bad for people, and that's what we got here. Yeah. I think the other point I want to make about the habit of the National Party is, I'm not surprised Collins and Goldsmith are pushing we'll roll back everything Labor did, but I think they'll roll it further back than what we had under Key and English. This is not Key and English. This is a more radical brand of conservative nationalism, National Party. And I think we would see them take employment relations back further towards the Employment Contracts Act days. That's the pedigree. That's what we're seeing in other policies. And I think if we were lucky, we would just end up where we were, and that's not great. But I think likely is, particularly if they had an ACT partner in government, it'll be back to the 90s, and that's something that none of us want to think about.
Yeah, that's quite scary. A key part of, I think, any jobs policy is going to be really having a think about what it looks like when and how climate change is going to be changing employment. It's going to be changing what jobs look like, and it's going to be really key, I think, any employment policy, any jobs policy, making sure that there's some sort of just transition as we move away from those sort of carbon-heavy jobs to more carbon-neutral or carbon-free jobs. So, Richard, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, look, I think it's really crucial that if we're going to fundamentally change our economy and our industries, and we do need to do that, we need to get out of carbon, we're going to do it anyway with new technology, that we provide a pathway through that takes everyone with us. And what we want to do, working people want to know that if they're going to change, there's a pathway for them that gets them there safely. And we need a government that is committed to a policy of just transition. And for us, that means we take everyone with us. We don't sort of make the burden on one group of workers having to take the whole burden of change. So even those workers in the oil industry or the carbon industries, we can't just abandon them and expect them to fight for themselves. In my view, what we need is a government approach, is the whole society needs to support those workers and their families to move to low carbon jobs. That means possibly active labour market policies, retraining, job creation, all of those kinds of things that support people to move from where they are now into new industries. And as I said, that's important in terms of climate change, but even things like new technology. A lot of those forces, if you like, for the future of work are going to mean industries are going to transform. Let's get behind that transformation, but let's make sure we don't leave people behind. And I think we're seeing the road reforms, we're seeing discussion in the future of work forums with this government, some good steps in that direction, but we need to do a lot more. And it's going to take not a passive state, but an active state. It's going to take the state stepping up and playing a really vital role in taking people with us, and like the Aotea wellbeing commitment, actually putting people first in that transition and not just leaving them to the vagaries of the market.
And when I read the Greenpeace Future is Here report, I get very much a sense, Amanda, that the just transition is a key part of that report.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the important thing to remember about a just transition is climate change is happening and carbon emissions are causing it. And that's a non-negotiable. We have to stop emitting carbon and other greenhouse gases because you can't negotiate with physics. There's no choice. We have to do it. What we do have a choice about is how we move away from it and how we support people through that transition, like Richard was saying. And I think it's really important to make that distinction because the current government has tended to talk about a just transition in a way that is kind of legitimizing a slow transition. And like I said, you can't negotiate with physics. We have to have an urgent move away from high carbon industries. But it is the role of government to make sure that people are supported through that process. And that's workers in high carbon industries. It's also communities that are dependent on high carbon industries. It's also making sure that the employment opportunities in new industries and in clean tech are distributed in a just way as well. So making sure that there's access for different demographics, and also making sure that people have good working conditions, because there have been cases in the clean energy industry of poor union representation, poor sort of working conditions and so on. So it's moving away from the old in a way that takes people with us, but also moving towards the new in a way that provides good job opportunities, good wages for people, and for all people, not just those who tend to be prioritized in job market.
Indeed. Neale, what's your thoughts on just transition?
Look, I think it's really important, as the last two speakers have laid out, that we do ensure a just transition for workers. It is a lot harder than I think we often think. Often governments look to be tokenistic and say, we'll throw you a few million for training and that'll sort you out. We shouldn't underestimate how much it can completely overturn someone's life. If you're a coal miner and you're living on the West Coast and suddenly your house is worth nothing and you're 55 years old and you're told you're going to be a coder, now you're going to learn to code. I mean, this is nonsense. So we've got to really make sure we put the investment behind looking after communities and families and regions where they're affected. The other point I'd make is it's actually really important for the sustainability politically of climate change policies. Going back to Richard's point, if workers in particular industries and regions feel that they are being made to bear the brunt, they will of course cling to what they've got. They will cling to their oil jobs or their coal jobs because, the alternative is their family being on the scrap heap. So we've got to make sure that we don't have what I call a green Thatcherism, where we say the market of the emission trading system will create this beautiful future and humanity, humans and, people and their families will be left behind in the wreckage. We did that in the 80s with neoliberalism, and we shouldn't do the same thing again through climate change.
Yeah. How possible is it that we're going to have, that parties can promise X or Y and have a reasonable expectation that they're going to deliver jobs?
Well, it's a tough question to predict anything at the moment, but I think what we can say is that we can predict that doing something will make a difference. And I think, again, a track record is good to look at. If you look at, I've noticed that National tries to be the campaign on jobs. They've done it for a long time now, as though they're the best at creating it. When in fact their record isn't anywhere near as good as what Labour-led governments have been. If you look at pre-pandemic times, in the Clark government, we had unemployment down to record levels, down to under 4%. Then we had the change of government to the last National government, And it crept up, and people will say, well, that was the global financial crisis, but actually New Zealand slipped from being number 2 in the world to being number 14 in the OECD. So we actually, even compared to our OECD comparators, we slipped dramatically when it came to jobs. When we had a return of a Labour Prime Minister in the current government, we saw unemployment plummet back down to the rates that it was, record low unemployment rates like we were back when we had Helen Clark. So that's a real embedded pattern there, which is really encouraging. We also had wage rises in a greater share of the economy, which is also very encouraging.
Yeah.
Clearly with the pandemic, the numbers are going to be hit. But, if you think about the wage subsidy scheme, I think it's most people would recognise that was tremendously successful as a short-term measure to hold people in jobs. The predictions back then were wild about it being double-digit even and well into the teens for unemployment. We haven't seen anything like that. And the predictions for a collapse in business, there's been some hardships, but it hasn't been the collapse that we've been predicting. I'm pretty sure if we hadn't have had those measures taken, it would have been a lot worse. So I think we can be reasonably confident that doing something will make a difference. And we just got to be sensible about what doing the most. What we have heard consistently from the Prime Minister and Grant Robertson is they will not let unemployment spiral out of control on their watch, and I think that's what we've seen. They've prevented that. It appears to me they're determined to keep it that way.